Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine stepping into a moonlit field on the Breton coast, where thousands of weathered granite sentinels stand in perfect silence. Row upon row, they stretch across the landscape for kilometres, more than 3,000 ancient stones, arranged with deliberate precision by hands that vanished millennia ago. This is Carnac, France, home to the largest concentration of standing stones anywhere on Earth. These menhirs have stood here since before Stonehenge was built, before the pyramids rose from Egyptian sands, witnesses to more than 6,000 years of human history. Yet their purpose remains one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. Recent discoveries in 2025 have begun to unlock new secrets buried beneath this ancient landscape, revealing traces of hearth fires, ritual gatherings, and the remarkable transition from a world of wandering hunters to settled communities capable of moving mountains of stone. But questions remain. Why did our Neolithic ancestors undertake such a monumental effort? What drove them to quarry, transport, and erect thousands of granite pillars in these precise alignments? What secret lies hidden among the standing stones of Carnac? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You awaken not in your familiar bed, but in a vast field beneath a pewter sky, where the last light of evening clings to the western horizon like a memory reluctant to fade. The air carries the salt tang of the nearby Atlantic, mingling with the earthier scents of heather and gorse that carpet this ancient Breton landscape. Beneath your feet the ground feels different, not the manicured softness of modern grass, but something wilder, more primeval, scattered with granite fragments that seem to have been waiting here since the world was young. As your eyes adjust to the gathering dusk, you begin to perceive them. At first, they might be mistaken for shadows, these dark sentinels that rise from the moorland like silent witnesses to forgotten ceremonies. But no, these are not shadows. They are stones. Hundreds upon hundreds of standing stones, stretching away from you in long, deliberate rows that vanish into the distance, their weathered surfaces catching what little moonlight filters through the clouded sky. Some tower above your head, reaching 4 meters into the night, while others stand no taller than your waist. Yet each occupies its place with the same quiet authority, the same patient endurance. This is Carnac, a name that means little to most of the modern world, yet here stands the greatest concentration of megalithic monuments anywhere on Earth. More than 3,000 menhirs, a word that simply means long stone in the ancient Breton tongue, rise from these coastal plains in western France, arranged not in the circular formations that mark other famous stone sites, but in something far more ambitious, vast linear alignments that march across the landscape for kilometres, as if an army of giants had been turned to stone mid-procession and left standing for eternity. You find yourself drawn forward, compelled to walk between these ancient markers, your footsteps muffled by the thick grass that grows in their shadows. The stones seem to part before you, revealing pathways worn by countless feet across countless centuries, though whether those feet belong to pilgrims, priests, or simply curious wanderers like yourself, the stones do not say. They have kept their secrets for 6,000 years, and they show no inclination to break their silence now. The arrangement becomes clearer as you move deeper into this stone forest. These are not random monoliths scattered by some geological accident, but deliberate constructions, organized into distinct groups of parallel rows. Here, 11 lines of stones converge and diverge like the strings of some enormous harp, their rhythm measured and purposeful. There another alignment begins, its stones gradually increasing in height as they progress westward, as if climbing an invisible staircase toward the sea. The precision speaks of human intention, of communities that possessed not only the physical strength to quarry, transport and erect these massive granite blocks, but also the organizational capacity to plan and execute such an ambitious undertaking across generations. Yet for all their obvious human origin, there is something otherworldly about these alignments in the half-light of evening. The stones seem to pulse with their own ancient rhythm, their surfaces bearing the patina of millennia, scarred by weather and time yet somehow still vital, still present in a way that makes the centuries collapse. You might be the first person to walk among them, or the millionth. The stones make no distinction. They have outlasted the Bronze Age, the Romans, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth of the modern world, standing sentinel through it all with the same imperturbable patience they display tonight. The village of Carnac itself lies nearby, its modest houses and narrow streets testament to the continuity of human settlement in this place, yet dwarfed utterly by the monuments that preceded it. The people who built these alignments left no written records, no carved inscriptions to explain their purpose or proclaim their achievements. They speak to us only through the mute testimony of worked stone, through the sheer audacity of their vision made manifest in granite and time. As you pause beside one of the larger menhirs, your hand naturally reaches out to touch its surface, feeling the roughness of weathered granite beneath your palm. The stone is cool, almost cold, yet there is something vital in its substance, some quality that connects you across the millennia to the hands that shaped it, the backs that laboured to raise it, the minds that conceived this vast stone symphony. In that moment of contact, the questions begin to form, as inevitable as the tide that beats against the nearby shore. Why did they do this? What drove communities of farmers and herders, people whose lives were bounded by the daily necessities of survival, to invest such enormous effort in these permanent monuments? What purpose did these alignments serve in the lives of people who left us no written explanations, no clear mythological tradition, no obvious connection to the great civilizations of antiquity? The stones offer no easy answers, only the profound satisfaction of a mystery perfectly preserved, waiting in the Breton twilight for anyone willing to listen to their ancient silence. To understand the stones, we must first step backward through time, crossing not decades or centuries but entire millennia, until we reach an age when the world itself wore a different face. Picture this same Breton coastline 6,000 years ago, when the great glaciers of the last ice age had finally retreated northward, leaving behind a landscape raw with possibility. The sea levels had stabilized at something close to their modern heights, carving the intricate coastline of bays and peninsulas that would prove so crucial to the people who would one day choose to call this place home. The climate was gentler then, warmer and more temperate than it had been for thousands of years. Oak and elm forests carpeted the inland hills, while the coastal plains supported expansive grasslands dotted with groves of hazel and birch. Rivers ran fuller and cleaner, providing abundant fresh water, while the nearby Atlantic offered its own bounty of fish, shellfish and marine mammals. This was a landscape of abundance, but more than that, it was a landscape of granite. The underlying geology of Brittany had gifted this region with something precious beyond measure: vast outcroppings of durable granite, stone that could be quarried, shaped, and erected to last for millennia. These granite formations, formed deep in the Earth's crust hundreds of millions of years earlier, now lay exposed and accessible, waiting for human hands capable of recognizing their potential. The stone was not uniform. Some veins ran harder and more resistant to weathering, others softer and more easily worked, but all of it possessed the fundamental quality that would make the monuments of Carnac possible: endurance. Into this promising landscape came people whose lives were undergoing a profound transformation. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed traces of their presence in the most intimate details. Foundation pits where stones once stood, hearths where families gathered around evening fires, the remnants of simple dwellings that speak of communities beginning to put down roots in ways their ancestors never had. At a site called La Plasca, not far from the Great Alignments, excavations have uncovered something remarkable: a monumental tomb dating to around 4,700 years before our Common Era, built directly above the remains of a much humbler structure, a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer hut, the temporary shelter of people whose lives had followed the rhythms of the hunt and the changing seasons. This layering of the old beneath the new tells a story of transition as profound as any in human history. The people who built that earlier hut lived as their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, moving through the landscape in small bands, following game and gathering the seasonal abundance of nuts, berries, and shellfish that the forests and shores provided. They left alike traces on the land, temporary camps, hearths that burned for a season and were abandoned, stone tools discarded when broken or no longer needed. Their relationship with the landscape was one of passage, of taking what was needed and moving on. But the people who built the tomb above that ancient hut had made different choices. They had begun to domesticate plants and animals, to clear forest for fields, to invest their labour in permanent improvements to the land that would benefit not just themselves, but their children and their children's children. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the great transformation from hunting and gathering to farming, and it brought with it an entirely new relationship with place, with time, and with community. The transition was neither sudden nor complete. For generations, these early farmers likely maintained many of the old ways, supplementing their cultivated grains and domesticated animals with hunting and gathering, moving seasonally between different sites as their ancestors had done. But gradually, inexorably, the logic of agriculture began to reshape their world. Cleared fields represented enormous investments of labour that could not be abandoned lightly. Stored grain required protection, oversight, community cooperation. Domesticated animals needed tending, breeding, careful management across seasons and years. Most importantly for our story, this new way of life created something that had never existed before in human society: the capacity for sustained, large-scale collective labour. Hunter-gatherer bands, by their very nature, remained small and mobile, rarely capable of marshalling the concentrated effort needed for monumental construction. But farming communities, rooted in place and bound together by shared investments in land and livestock, could organise themselves differently. They could plan projects that would take not days or weeks, but months or years to complete. They could coordinate the labour of hundreds of people across multiple seasons, multiple generations even, and they could begin to think in terms of permanence, of creating things that would outlast their own brief lives and speak for their communities across the vast expanses of time. The granite outcroppings that dotted their landscape began to look different through these new eyes, not merely obstacles to be worked around, but raw material for something unprecedented in human history. Architecture designed not for the living, but for eternity. The people who would eventually create the great stone alignments of Carnac were still centuries away from beginning that monumental project, but already, in these early Neolithic communities, we can see the foundations being laid: social, technological, and conceptual. They were learning to work stone on an ever larger scale, developing the tools and techniques needed to quarry granite, shape it, and move it across considerable distances. They were creating the social institutions necessary to coordinate complex collective endeavours. And perhaps most crucially, they were developing the vision, the audacity to imagine that mere humans might create something truly permanent in an impermanent world. You return now to the stones themselves, but with eyes newly open to the magnitude of what you witness. No longer do these granite sentinels appear as random monuments scattered across the landscape, but as components of something far more ambitious, a vast architectural statement written across kilometres of Breton moorland in the language of worked stone. As you move deeper into the heart of the alignments, the true scope of this ancient undertaking begins to reveal itself, row by patient row. The most extensive of these stone arrays bears the name Menec, derived from the Breton words meaning place of stones, a designation both modest and inadequate for what confronts you here. 11 distinct rows of menhirs march westward across the landscape, their lines converging and diverging like the furrows of some titanic field ploughed by giants. The alignment stretches for more than a kilometre, encompassing over 1,000 individual stones, each one deliberately positioned according to principles we can observe but not fully comprehend. You find yourself walking between these ancient rows, your footsteps falling into the rhythm established by the spacing of the stones. Here, the pattern becomes visceral, felt as much as seen. The intervals are not uniform. Sometimes the stones stand close together, creating an almost intimate atmosphere of enclosure, while at other points they spread wider, opening vistas across the moorland that allow the eye to travel the full length of the alignment. This variation seems purposeful, designed to create different experiences, different moods as one progresses through the stone forest. Most remarkably, the stones themselves change as you walk among them, growing and shrinking in an orchestrated symphony of granite. At the eastern end of the Menec alignment, the menhirs tower above you, some reaching 4 metres into the sky, monuments that would dominate any landscape. But as you move westward, following the invisible logic of the ancient builders, the stones gradually diminish. What began as towering monoliths become modest markers, some standing no taller than your waist. Their presence felt more through their position in the great pattern than through their individual monumentality. Yet this is not simply a story of diminishment. As you continue your journey through the stone rows, the pattern reverses itself. The menhirs begin to grow again, resuming their commanding presence, as if the alignment were breathing, expanding and contracting in slow geological rhythm. The effect is both subtle and profound, creating a sense of movement, of progression through different phases of some ancient ceremony whose purpose we can only imagine. At either end of this great stone procession, you encounter something different entirely. The linear precision of the rows gives way to circular arrangements, cromlechs, or stone circles, that seem to anchor the alignments like massive punctuation marks in the granite text. These circles, though much disturbed by time and human interference, once enclosed spaces that may have served as gathering places, ritual centres, or symbolic gateways between the ordered world of the alignments and the wild landscape beyond. Moving south from Menec, you encounter the second great alignment system, known today as Camario, the place of the dead, a name that hints at the funerary associations that seem to permeate this entire sacred landscape. Here, over 1,000 stones arrange themselves in 10 distinct rows, their granite forms weathered by millennia of Atlantic storms yet still maintaining their essential dignity. The Camario alignment differs from Menec in its proportions, its rhythm, its relationship to the surrounding topography, yet it clearly belongs to the same grand design, part of a larger vision that encompassed not just individual monuments, but entire stretches of coastland. The third major component of this stone symphony lies further to the east, where the Curlescan alignment adds its own voice to the ancient chorus. Here, fewer stones remain standing. Only about 300 survive from what was once a much larger array, but their positioning reveals the same careful attention to spacing, height, and orientation that characterizes the other alignments. The stones of Curlescan are generally smaller than their cousins at Menec, yet they possess their own quiet authority, their own contribution to the overall effect. Standing among these stones, you begin to appreciate the sophistication of their construction. Each menhir was quarried from the local granite outcroppings, shaped using stone tools and patient human labour, then transported to its designated position, and erected with precision that speaks of advanced understanding of leverage, coordination, and engineering principles. The larger stones would have required teams of dozens of workers, equipped with ropes, wooden rollers, and the kind of communal organisation that could sustain such efforts across the seasons and years needed to complete the alignments. The granite itself bears witness to this ancient craftsmanship. Though weathered by 6 millennia of exposure, the stones still show traces of the work that shaped them, the subtle tapering that makes them more stable, the careful selection of rock faces that would best resist the elements, the positioning that takes advantage of natural fissures and grain patterns in the stone. These were not crude monuments hastily erected, but carefully considered works of architecture, designed to endure across the vast spans of geological time. As evening deepens around you, and the alignments fade into silhouette against the darkening sky, you find yourself wondering at the vision that could conceive such a project, the social cohesion that could sustain it, and the beliefs that could justify such an enormous investment of human energy in something so permanent, so deliberately eternal. As you wander away from the great stone alignments, following pathways worn by countless feet across the centuries, you begin to notice other monuments scattered across this ancient landscape, structures that speak not of processions or ceremonies, but of something more intimate and eternal, the quiet presence of the dead. These are the dolmens of Carnac, stone chambers that once sheltered the remains of people who lived and died in the shadow of the great alignments, their bones now dust but their monuments enduring like solemn promises carved in granite. The word dolmen comes from the Breton tongue, meaning simply stone table. Yet this modest description hardly captures the profound significance of these structures. Picture yourself approaching one of these ancient tombs in the gathering dusk, its massive capstone balanced with perfect precision atop vertical supports, creating a chamber that has remained undisturbed for millennia. Originally, this stone skeleton would have been buried beneath a great mound of earth and smaller stones, a tumulus that rose from the landscape like a small hill, marking the presence of the dead for any who passed by. Time and weather have stripped away most of these earthen coverings, leaving the dolmens exposed like weathered bones, their stark geometry silhouetted against the darkening sky. Yet even in their current state, these monuments possess a haunting dignity, a quiet authority that speaks of the care with which they were constructed and the reverence with which they were regarded by those who built them. Each dolmen represents not merely a tomb, but a statement of permanence, a declaration that some lives, some deaths, deserve to be remembered across the vast expanses of geological time. The distribution of these burial monuments across the Carnac landscape reveals something crucial about the society that created both the alignments and the tombs. This was not a world divided between the sacred and the secular, but rather a unified sacred geography where the living and the dead occupied the same carefully ordered space. The dolmens cluster around the great stone alignments, suggesting that those who were laid to rest in these granite chambers maintained some connection, in death as in life, to the mysterious ceremonies that may have unfolded among the standing stones. East of the village of Carnac itself, the landscape rises into a modest hill that commands sweeping views of the surrounding countryside. Here stands one of the most remarkable monuments in all of Europe, the Saint-Michel tumulus, a massive artificial mound that represents perhaps the most ambitious single construction project undertaken by the Neolithic peoples of this region. The tumulus stretches 125 metres along its base and 50 metres across, rising more than 10 metres above the surrounding terrain, dimensions that speak of a communal effort comparable in scope to the great alignments themselves. When archaeologists first penetrated the interior of this ancient mound in the 19th century, they discovered a complex arrangement of stone chambers and passages, carefully constructed galleries that had been sealed for thousands of years. Within these silent chambers lay the remains of what could only be described as prestigious burials, individuals who had been interred with an array of grave goods that marked them as people of exceptional status within their communities. The inventory of these ancient treasures reads like a catalogue of Neolithic craftsmanship and wealth, finely worked stone axes, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness, pottery vessels decorated with intricate geometric patterns, necklaces of carefully shaped beads, ornamental objects whose purpose we can only guess at, but whose beauty remains undimmed by the millennia. These were not the simple burial goods of ordinary farmers or herders, but the regalia of an elite class, people whose lives had been distinguished by power, prestige, or perhaps spiritual authority that elevated them above their contemporaries. The very existence of such elaborate burials forces us to reconsider our assumptions about Neolithic society. The communities that built the alignments and dolmens of Carnac were not the egalitarian groups of simple farmers that earlier archaeological theories had imagined, but complex societies with clear hierarchies of status and power. The labour required to construct the Saint-Michel tumulus, the precious objects buried within it, the carefully planned architecture of its internal chambers, all of this speaks of social systems sophisticated enough to accumulate wealth, organise large-scale projects, and maintain distinctions of rank across generations. Yet these elite burials were not isolated monuments to individual power, but integral components of the larger sacred landscape. The Saint-Michel tumulus overlooks the great alignments, positioned to maintain a visual and symbolic connection between the world of the dead and the realm of the standing stones. The message seems clear. Even in death, the most privileged members of these ancient communities remained participants in whatever cosmic drama was enacted among the menhirs below. Other burial mounds dot the landscape around Carnac, each one a smaller echo of the great tumulus, each one sheltering the remains of individuals whose names have vanished, but whose presence still marks the ancient geography of memory. Some of these mounds have been excavated, revealing their own collections of grave goods, their own evidence of social distinction preserved in stone and earth. Others remain untouched, their secrets waiting beneath centuries of accumulated soil, patient as the granite alignments themselves. As you stand among these monuments to the ancient dead, the full scope of what the Neolithic peoples of Carnac achieved begins to emerge. This was not simply a collection of impressive monuments, but a comprehensive reimagining of the relationship between landscape, memory, and human destiny. A sacred geography where the living and the dead, the temporary and the eternal were woven together in granite and earth. Behind the monuments that still command our attention across the millennia lies a quieter story, one written not in granite, but in the accumulated traces of daily existence, the rhythm of seasons, the patient tending of crops and animals, the countless small decisions that sustain the communities capable of such monumental undertakings. To understand the stones of Carnac, we must first understand the lives of those who raised them, the ordinary human world that made such extraordinary achievements possible. You rise with the pale light filtering through the doorway of a simple dwelling, its walls built from the same granite that would soon stand eternal in the alignments, but here shaped into more modest forms, rough blocks fitted together with clay and organic mortar, creating spaces designed for the warmth of human habitation, rather than the cold permanence of monuments. The air carries the familiar sense of a Neolithic morning, wood smoke from carefully tended hearths, the earthy aroma of grain stores, the sharper tang of domesticated animals stirring in their enclosures nearby. This is the world revealed by recent excavations at sites like La Plaska, where archaeologists have uncovered not just the foundation pits of vanished menhirs, but the humble hearths that burned beside them, evidence of communities who lived intimately with their monumental creations, for whom the great stone alignments were not distant sacred sites, but integral parts of their daily landscape. These hearths speak of gatherings, of meals shared in the shadow of the stones, of the social bonds that made collective labour possible across the generations needed to complete such ambitious projects. Your day begins, as it would have for countless mornings across the centuries of construction, with the tending of responsibilities that bridge the gap between survival and vision. The cleared fields that surround your settlement require constant attention. Grain to be planted, weeded, harvested, stored against the lean months of winter. The domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs that represent your community's wealth and security need pasture, water, protection from predators both animal and human. These are the mundane foundations upon which monumental architecture rests, the agricultural surplus and social organisation that free some hands from the immediate demands of subsistence to work instead with stone and eternity. Yet even as you move through these daily tasks, the presence of the growing alignment shapes every aspect of life. The quarries that provide stone for the monuments also yield material for more practical needs, grinding stones for processing grain, foundation blocks for houses, tools and vessels carved from granite's durable substance. The same skills that allow workers to shape massive menhirs also serve to create the everyday implements that make civilized life possible. The ropes and wooden rollers used to transport monoliths across the landscape find smaller applications in the movement of harvests, building materials, trade goods that connect your community to others scattered across the Breton Peninsula. As the seasons turn, you witness the gradual accumulation of effort that transforms landscape through human will. Teams of workers appear at the quarry sites, their voices carrying across the moorland as they coordinate the delicate work of splitting granite along its natural grain, shaping rough blocks into the precise forms required by the master builders. The sound of stone striking stone becomes a constant counterpoint to the agricultural rhythms of your community, a percussion that speaks of permanence being wrestled from the temporary world of human ambition. The transportation of the finished stones requires occasions of extraordinary communal effort, moments when the entire population of the settlement and its neighbours must coordinate their strength toward a single goal. You join the crowds that gather around the massive wooden sleds that bear the menhirs, adding your hands to the ropes, your voice to the working songs that help synchronize the pull of dozens of people across difficult terrain. The erection of each stone becomes a celebration, a festival that marks not just the completion of another element in the grand design, but the reaffirmation of social bonds that make such collective achievements possible. The stones, once raised, become landmarks in your daily geography, reference points that organize not just the physical landscape but the social and spiritual dimensions of community life. Children play in their shadows, learning the stories and traditions that give meaning to these granite markers. Seasonal festivals align themselves with the rhythms established by the monuments, creating calendars that merge astronomical observations with agricultural necessities and social celebrations. The alignments become stages for the rituals that mark important transitions, births, marriages, deaths, the passage from one season to another, the great moments when individual lives intersect with the larger patterns of cosmic time. Evening finds you again beside the hearths, whose embers have been preserved by recent archaeological work. The same fires whose warmth sustained the builders of the alignments through countless nights of planning, storytelling, and community bonding. The conversations that flow around these flames carry the accumulated wisdom of generations, technical knowledge about working stone, social traditions that govern collective labour, spiritual beliefs that justify such enormous investments in permanence. This is where the monuments truly live, not in their silent granite forms, but in the continuing human consciousness that remembers their meaning, tends their significance, passes their purpose from one generation to the next. The stones stand silent in the darkness, offering no explanations for their presence, no inscriptions to decode, no obvious clues to unlock the intentions of their builders. Yet this very silence has not prevented generations of scholars, antiquarians, and curious observers from proposing theories about their purpose, hypotheses that reveal as much about the questioners as about the ancient monuments themselves. As you contemplate these granite sentinels in the gathering night, you find yourself drawn into one of archaeology's most enduring debates. Why did the people of Carnac invest such enormous effort in creating these precise alignments across their landscape? The most persistent theory, one that gained considerable credibility during the 19th and 20th centuries, suggests that the alignments functioned as a vast astronomical observatory, a Stone Age computer designed to track the movements of celestial bodies across the seasons and years. Proponents of this interpretation point to the careful orientation of the stone rows, their apparent alignment with significant points on the horizon where the sun rises and sets during solstices and equinoxes, the potential correlation between the spacing of individual menhires and the complex cycles of lunar observation that would have been crucial for agricultural societies dependent on precise seasonal timing. The astronomical hypothesis possesses an appealing elegance, transforming the seemingly random distribution of stones into components of an intricate mechanism for measuring cosmic time. According to this interpretation, the varying heights of the menhirs serve not merely aesthetic purposes but functional ones, creating sightlines that allow observers to track the subtle movements of sun, moon, and stars across the dome of the sky. The alignments become calendars written in granite, enabling Neolithic communities to predict the optimal times for planting and harvest, to anticipate the return of migratory animals, to coordinate the seasonal festivals that bound their societies together. Yet for all its intellectual appeal, the astronomical theory faces significant challenges when confronted with the archaeological evidence. The alignments are not oriented with the mathematical precision that would be necessary for accurate celestial observation, and many of the supposed astronomical correlations require selective interpretation of the data. More troubling still, the theory tends to impose modern assumptions about the separation between sacred and practical functions onto ancient peoples who may have made no such distinctions. Alternative interpretations have emerged from different scholarly traditions, each offering its own lens through which to view the monuments. Some researchers propose that the alignments served as processional routes, sacred pathways along which ritual participants moved during seasonal ceremonies or rites of passage. The linear arrangement of the stones, the varying spaces between them, the gradual changes in height as one moves along the rows, all of these features could be understood as elements designed to create specific experiential effects during ceremonial processions. This processional theory gains support from ethnographic parallels with other cultures that have created linear sacred landscapes, pathways that guide participants through transformative spiritual experiences. The stones become not instruments for measuring celestial movements, but markers for measuring human transformation, waypoints along journeys that carried individuals or communities from one state of being to another. The alignments create sacred geography, transforming ordinary landscape into ritual space through the simple but profound act of erecting permanent markers that define spiritual territory. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new complexity to our understanding of the stone's possible functions. The excavations at La Plasca revealed not just the foundation pits of vanished menhirs, but also the remains of hearths and cooking areas positioned near the stones, evidence of communal gatherings, feasting, and social activities that accompanied the erection and use of the monuments. These findings suggest that the stones were not merely distant objects of contemplation, but integral parts of a lived social landscape, where communities came together for purposes that blended the practical, the social, and the sacred in ways that our modern categories struggle to capture. The hearth discoveries hint at another possible function for the alignments, as focal points for community identity and social cohesion. The massive collective labour required to erect the stones would have created opportunities for different groups to work together, to share resources and knowledge, to forge the social bonds that made complex societies possible. The monuments themselves, then, became permanent reminders of these collaborative achievements, symbols of what communities could accomplish when they united their efforts toward common goals. Perhaps most intriguingly, the proximity of the alignments to the elaborate burial monuments suggests another layer of meaning. The stones may have served as memorials to the ancestors, permanent markers that maintained the presence of the dead within the landscape of the living. In many traditional societies, ancestor veneration plays a crucial role in legitimizing social hierarchies, territorial claims, and community identity. The alignments could represent a vast genealogical landscape, where each stone or group of stones commemorated particular lineages, particular achievements, particular claims to place and status that needed to be remembered across generations. As you stand among these ancient markers, contemplating the multiple theories that scholars have woven around them, you begin to appreciate why the question of their purpose remains so persistently enigmatic. The stones resist simple explanations precisely because they likely served multiple, overlapping functions that evolved over the centuries of their construction and use. They were probably astronomical markers and processional routes and memorial landscapes and social gathering places and territorial markers, all of these things simultaneously, their meaning shifting and accumulating as the communities that built them changed and developed. The mystery of Carnac may lie not in discovering the single correct interpretation of the stones, but in learning to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, to appreciate the sophistication of ancient peoples who created monuments complex enough to sustain centuries of scholarly debate and wonder. Time moves differently in the realm of stone than in the world of human ambition, and as the centuries passed over the alignments of Carnac, the forces of change began their patient work of transformation. The communities that had invested such monumental effort in raising these granite sentinels were themselves subject to the same inexorable processes that weather stone and shift coastlines, the quiet evolution of social structures, the gradual drift of beliefs and practices, the simple fact that no human institution, however deeply rooted, remains unchanged across the vast spans of time required to complete such ambitious projects. The alignments themselves bear witness to this slow metamorphosis. Archaeological evidence suggests that the great stone rows were not erected in a single burst of coordinated activity, but across several centuries of sustained effort, with different phases of construction reflecting the changing priorities and capabilities of successive generations. The earliest stones, dating to the middle of the 5th millennium before our Common Era, were followed by additions, modifications, and extensions that continued for hundreds of years, each generation adding their own interpretation to the grand design inherited from their predecessors. As you walk among the stones in the deepening twilight, you begin to notice subtle discontinuities in their arrangement, places where the precise geometric relationships seem to falter, where the careful spacing becomes irregular, where stones of different character and workmanship suggest the involvement of communities with different technical traditions or aesthetic sensibilities. These variations speak of a project that evolved organically over time, shaped not by a single master plan but by the accumulated decisions of many generations of builders, each working within the constraints and possibilities of their own historical moment. The burial practices associated with the monuments reveal similar patterns of gradual transformation. The earliest tombs, contemporary with the first phases of stone erection, reflect elaborate mortuary traditions that required enormous investments of labour and resources. The Saint Michel tumulus and its contemporaries represent the pinnacle of this tradition. Their complex internal architecture and rich grave goods, testament to societies capable of supporting substantial social hierarchies and accumulating significant wealth for display in death as in life. But as centuries passed, the character of burial monuments began to change. Later tombs show simpler construction, fewer grave goods, different relationships to the landscape that suggest shifting concepts of death, ancestry, and social organization. The elaborate mortuary practices that had once justified such massive communal efforts gradually gave way to more modest traditions, as if the spiritual or social functions that had originally demanded monumental expression were being fulfilled through different means, or perhaps were no longer felt to require such permanent and public demonstration. The alignments themselves became caught up in these broader currents of social change. As the original purposes that had motivated their construction faded from living memory, the stones began to acquire new functions, new meanings that reflected the evolving needs of the communities that inherited them. What had once been sacred processional routes may have become simple pathway markers, guiding travellers across the moorland from one settlement to another. Stones that had once marked astronomical observations or ritual gathering places may have been repurposed as territorial boundaries, marking the limits between different communities' lands or grazing rights. Some of the monuments suffered more direct forms of transformation. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain dolmens were reused as shelters for livestock during harsh weather, their ancient sanctity forgotten in favour of immediate practical needs. Other stones were incorporated into later construction projects, their worked surfaces providing ready-made building material for communities no longer bound by whatever taboos had once protected the monuments from such utilitarian appropriation. The very landscape around the alignments began to change as well, reflecting broader transformations in how human communities related to their environment. Agricultural practices evolved, requiring different patterns of land use that may have conflicted with the original sacred geography of the monuments. New settlements arose in locations that had nothing to do with the ancient stone arrangements, their inhabitants perhaps viewing the alignments as curious relics from a bygone age rather than as living components of their spiritual or social landscape. Most poignantly, the social knowledge that had once given meaning to the monuments, the stories, traditions, and ritual practices that had made sense of their purpose, began to fade from collective memory. Without written records to preserve their significance, the alignments became increasingly dependent on oral tradition for their continued relevance to human communities. As populations shifted, as new cultural influences arrived from elsewhere, as the practical challenges of daily life demanded attention to more immediate concerns, the careful preservation of ancient knowledge became more difficult to maintain across the generations. The stones themselves, built to endure across geological time, proved more durable than the human memories that had created them. Granite weathers slowly, resisting the forces that transform landscapes and civilizations alike, but the meanings invested in stone by human consciousness are far more fragile. As the centuries accumulated, the alignments of Carnac began their slow transformation from living sacred landscape to archaeological mystery, their original purposes fading into the realm of scholarly speculation and romantic conjecture. Yet even in decline, even in the gradual erosion of their intended significance, the monuments retained something of their power to inspire wonder. The communities that inherited them, even without understanding their original functions, recognized something extraordinary in their presence, an achievement that spoke of capabilities and ambitions that exceeded anything in their own experience. The stones became objects of curiosity, speculation, and eventually legend. As the original meanings of the stones faded from human memory, replaced by the fragmentary traditions of succeeding generations, a curious transformation began to occur. The monuments that had once stood as comprehensible components of a living sacred landscape gradually assumed the more mysterious character of ancient riddles, their purpose obscured by the accumulation of centuries and the inevitable distortions that affect all knowledge transmitted through oral tradition alone. Into the void left by forgotten history flowed something equally powerful, if less precise: the human need to explain, to create meaning from mystery, to weave stories that could make sense of the inexplicable presence of these granite sentinels standing guard over the Breton moorlands. The legends that eventually crystallized around the alignments of Carnac reflect the cultural preoccupations of the peoples who encountered them across the centuries, each generation interpreting the stones through the lens of their own beliefs and experiences. During the Roman occupation of Gaul, when Latin-speaking administrators and soldiers first encountered these ancient monuments, they found themselves confronted by evidence of achievements that predated their own civilization by millennia. The Romans, ever practical in their approach to conquest and administration, seem to have regarded the stones with a mixture of curiosity and indifference, neither understanding their original purpose nor feeling compelled to develop elaborate explanations for their existence. But as Roman power waned, and Christian influence spread across the former provinces of Gaul, the stones began to acquire new layers of interpretive meaning. The early Christian communities of Brittany, struggling to establish their faith in a landscape still haunted by the material remnants of pre-Christian belief found in the alignments both a challenge and an opportunity. These massive monuments could not be ignored or easily destroyed, but they could be reinterpreted, their pagan associations neutralized through the creation of new stories that explained their presence in terms compatible with Christian cosmology. From this need arose some of the most enduring legends associated with Carnac, stories that transformed the granite alignments into monuments to Christian triumph over ancient paganism. One particularly persistent tale claimed that the stones were the remains of a Roman legion that had been pursuing St. Cornelius, the 3rd century pope who had fled to Brittany to escape imperial persecution. According to this legend, when the Roman soldiers cornered the saint at the edge of the sea, divine intervention transformed them into stone, preserving them forever as a warning against those who would persecute the faithful. The parallel rows of menhirs became ranks of petrified legionnaires, their original purpose forgotten in favour of a narrative that served the theological needs of medieval Christianity. Another strand of local tradition wove the stones into the broader tapestry of Arthurian legend, claiming that they were the work of Merlin himself, the wizard whose magic had already populated the British landscape with megalithic marvels like Stonehenge. In this version of events, the great magician had commanded the stones to arrange themselves into their current formations for reasons known only to him, transforming the patient labour of Neolithic communities into the instantaneous achievement of supernatural power. The appeal of such explanations lay not merely in their dramatic content, but in their ability to preserve the sense of wonder that the monuments inspired while providing a framework for understanding that required no archaeological investigation or historical analysis. These legendary explanations possessed a seductive power that extended far beyond the medieval communities in which they originated. Even as scholarly interest in the monuments began to develop during the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic interpretations continued to flourish, alongside more systematic archaeological approaches. The stones of Carnac became magnets for speculation about ancient druids, lost civilizations, and mysterious religious practices, their actual Neolithic origins often overshadowed by more exotic theories that appealed to contemporary fascinations with the occult and the primitive. The very persistence of such romantic interpretations reveals something important about the relationship between mystery and human consciousness. The scientific method, with its emphasis on evidence and systematic investigation, offers powerful tools for understanding the past, but it cannot always satisfy the deeper human need for meaning, for stories that connect ancient achievements to contemporary concerns and aspirations. The legends that grew up around Carnac served psychological and social functions that archaeological accuracy could not fulfill, providing narratives of transformation, divine intervention, and supernatural agency that spoke to fundamental questions about human destiny and cosmic order. Yet for all their imaginative appeal, these legendary explanations also obscured the genuine historical achievement represented by the alignments. By attributing the stones to saints, wizards, or divine intervention, the stories effectively denied agency to the actual human communities that had created them, diminishing the extraordinary accomplishment of Neolithic peoples who had organized themselves sufficiently to undertake such monumental projects. The real miracle of Carnac lay not in supernatural intervention, but in human cooperation, not in magic, but in the patient accumulation of technical knowledge and social organization across generations of sustained effort. As you stand among the stones in the gathering darkness, contemplating the layers of interpretation that have accumulated around them, like sediment around archaeological artifacts, you begin to appreciate both the beauty and the limitations of legendary explanation. The stories possess their own truth, revealing the needs and aspirations of the communities that created them, but they also demonstrate how easily authentic history can be obscured by the more immediate appeal of myth and romance. The centuries that followed the creation of legends around the stones brought a different kind of transformation, one marked not by the accumulation of new meanings but by the gradual erosion of human attention itself. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, and as the rhythms of rural life in Brittany began to respond to broader economic and social changes sweeping across Europe, the ancient monuments of Carnac entered a phase of benign neglect that would prove, in many ways, more destructive than active hostility had ever been. The stones, built to endure the geological ages, proved surprisingly vulnerable to the casual indifference of communities that had inherited them without inheriting any sense of responsibility for their preservation. Farmers clearing new fields found the menhirs obstacles to efficient cultivation, impediments to the straight furrows required by evolving agricultural techniques. Many stones were simply toppled, their granite bulk left to lie where it fell, gradually sinking into the earth under the weight of accumulated seasons. Others were broken apart, their durable material repurposed for more immediate needs, foundation stones for houses, material for roadways, components of field walls that served the practical needs of rural communities with no patience for the mysterious intentions of long-dead builders. The dolmens, those ancient burial chambers that had once sheltered the remains of Neolithic elites, found themselves pressed into service for more humble purposes. Local farmers discovered that the stone chambers, already roofed and partially enclosed, made excellent shelters for livestock during the harsh Breton winters. Some were converted into storage spaces for grain or tools, their sacred character forgotten in favour of immediate utility. A few were even transformed into ovens, their granite walls providing ideal thermal mass for baking bread, the capstones blackened by centuries of smoke from fires that their original builders could never have imagined. By the beginning of the 19th century, when the first systematic surveys of the monuments began, the full extent of this casual destruction became apparent. Early antiquarians, working with primitive measuring tools and limited resources, documented alignments that already showed significant gaps, rows of stones interrupted by empty spaces where menhirs had once stood. Their careful drawings and written descriptions provide melancholy testimony to a landscape already much diminished from its original grandeur, yet still impressive enough to inspire wonder in those with eyes to see the achievement that survived beneath the accumulated damage of centuries. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new attention to the monuments, but attention of a character that sometimes proved as problematic as neglect had been. Wealthy tourists and amateur archaeologists, inspired by fashionable interest in the sublime and the primitive, began to visit Carnac in increasing numbers, seeking experiences that would connect them to what they imagined as the mystical wisdom of ancient peoples. Some of these visitors, operating under the assumption that a single stone removed as a souvenir could hardly matter among so many, contributed to the gradual attrition of the monuments through well-meaning but ultimately destructive enthusiasm. The emergence of professional archaeology during the later 19th century marked a turning point in the stone's fortunes, though not necessarily an improvement in their immediate prospects. Early archaeological investigations, conducted with the crude techniques available at the time, often inflicted more damage than previous centuries of neglect had managed. Excavations undertaken with picks and shovels, driven more by curiosity than systematic methodology, disturbed the delicate relationships between stones and soil, destroying evidence that more sophisticated later techniques might have preserved and interpreted. Yet these same investigations also began to reveal the true antiquity and significance of the monuments, gradually replacing romantic speculation with evidence-based understanding. As scholars began to appreciate the sophisticated planning and enormous labour investment that the alignments represented, and as the development of improved dating techniques pushed their origins ever further back into prehistory, a new kind of reverence began to emerge, one based not on legendary associations, but on genuine respect for the human achievement they represented. This growing appreciation eventually translated into official recognition and protection. The major alignments, Menec, Kermachio and Kerlesken, were designated as historic monuments under French law, a status that provided legal protection against further destruction, but also created new challenges related to access and interpretation. The French state acquired much of the land surrounding the stones, removing it from private ownership and the immediate pressures of agricultural or commercial development that had threatened the sites for centuries. The later 20th century brought more sophisticated approaches to conservation, informed by advancing archaeological science and growing understanding of the complex relationships between monuments, landscape, and the communities that had created them. Protective fencing, installed beginning in 1991, restricted public access to the most vulnerable areas, recognizing that the very popularity of the sites had begun to create new threats to their preservation. The constant passage of thousands of visitors each year was gradually eroding the ancient soil around the stones, threatening the archaeological deposits that might still yield insights into their original construction and use. This tension between preservation and access continues to shape the experience of Carnac today, creating a landscape where the ancient monuments exist within a framework of modern management that seeks to balance respect for their archaeological integrity with the legitimate desire of contemporary visitors to experience their enduring power. The stones that once stood open to the wind and weather, accessible to any who wished to walk among them, now exist within a carefully regulated environment that reflects our modern understanding of both their fragility and their irreplaceable value as witnesses to humanity's deep past. Just as the stones of Carnac seem destined to yield their secrets only reluctantly, surrendering fragments of meaning across centuries of patient investigation, the early decades of the 21st century have witnessed a remarkable acceleration in our understanding of these ancient monuments. New technologies, more sophisticated methodologies, and most crucially, a willingness to look beyond the stones themselves to the human activities that surrounded their creation, have begun to illuminate corners of the Neolithic world that had remained dark since the last hearth fires were extinguished more than 6,000 years ago. The breakthrough came not from any single dramatic discovery, but from the patient accumulation of evidence gathered by an international team of archaeologists working at a site called La Plasca, located in the commune of Pluharnel, not far from the great alignments that have long captured scholarly attention. Here, beginning in the early years of this decade, researchers from the University of Gothenburg, working in collaboration with the French archaeological firm Archaeodunum and supported by institutions across Europe, began to uncover traces of human activity that would fundamentally alter our understanding of how the monuments of Carnac came into being. The team's investigations, published in 2025 in the prestigious journal Antiquity, revealed something that previous generations of archaeologists had not thought to look for: the ghostly impressions left by stones that no longer stand. Using advanced geophysical techniques that can detect subtle variations in soil density and composition, the researchers identified foundation pits that once held menhirs, their location still marked in the earth despite the absence of the granite monuments they once supported. These invisible stones, revealed only through scientific detection, proved to be arranged in the same careful alignments as their surviving neighbours, extending the known patterns of the monuments into areas where casual observation would suggest that no such organisation had ever existed. More remarkable still were the discoveries made in the immediate vicinity of these foundation pits. Careful excavation revealed the remains of hearths, cooking areas, and other evidence of human activity dating to the same period as the stone erections. These were not the casual traces left by later visitors to the site, but deliberate installations created by the same communities responsible for raising the menhirs themselves. The implications were profound and immediate. The construction of the alignments had not been a purely ceremonial or religious activity carried out in sacred isolation, but an integral part of the daily life of Neolithic communities, surrounded by the smoke of cooking fires and the social interactions that such communal activities naturally fostered. The excavations at La Plasca also revealed something even more extraordinary: evidence of the moment when one world gave way to another. Beneath a monumental tomb, dating to approximately 4,700 years before our Common Era, the archaeologists uncovered the remains of a much humbler structure, a Mesolithic hut that had sheltered hunter-gatherers in the millennia before the great stone monuments were conceived. The tomb had been built directly over this earlier dwelling, creating a physical stratigraphy that captured one of the most significant transitions in human history: the shift from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life, from temporary shelters to permanent monuments, from societies that moved lightly across the landscape to those capable of investing enormous labour in reshaping that landscape according to their vision of cosmic order. The dating techniques applied to these discoveries have pushed back the origins of the Carnac monuments to between 4,600 and 4,300 years before our Common Era, making them among the earliest megalithic constructions anywhere in Europe. This temporal precision, achieved through radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in direct association with the stone foundations, has transformed our understanding of the relationship between Carnac and other famous megalithic sites. The Breton alignments were not inspired by Stonehenge or other well-known monuments, but preceded them by centuries, representing an independent and perhaps originating tradition of monumental stone architecture. Yet the most significant revelation emerging from the La Plasca excavations concerns not chronology, but the human dimension of monument construction. The presence of hearths and cooking areas near the stone foundations suggests that the erection of each menhir was accompanied by communal gatherings, perhaps involving feasting, ritual activities, and social celebrations that transformed the practical work of raising stones into occasions of community bonding and spiritual significance. The monuments emerge from this evidence not as the products of forced labour or grim religious obligation, but as expressions of social cohesion, collective celebration, and shared commitment to projects that would benefit not just the living, but generations yet unborn. This new understanding reframes the entire Carnac landscape as something far more dynamic and socially complex than previous interpretations had suggested. The alignments were not simply astronomical calculators or processional routes, though they may have served such functions, but focal points for ongoing community life, places where the practical and the sacred, the individual and the collective, the temporary and the eternal, came together in the smoke of ancient fires and the patient labour of moving stone. As you stand among the surviving stones of Carnac in the deepening night, surrounded by the monuments that have endured across 6 millennia, it becomes impossible to ignore the profound silence that speaks not only of what remains, but of all that has been lost to the patient erosion of time. The alignments that still command our wonder represent merely fragments of what once existed here, scattered survivors from a much larger and more complex sacred landscape that extended across kilometres of Breton moorland and encompassed thousands of individual monuments, each one positioned according to principles we can only partially reconstruct from the evidence that chance and human carelessness have allowed to survive. The true scope of this loss becomes apparent only when we consider the methodical documentation undertaken by 19th century antiquarians, whose careful surveys revealed alignments already much reduced from their original grandeur. Their maps and drawings, preserved in archives across Europe, show stones that stood intact when Napoleon was consolidating his empire, but have since fallen victim to the casual indifference of communities that viewed them as obstacles rather than treasures. Row upon row of menhirs that once extended the great alignments beyond their current boundaries have vanished entirely, their granite substance repurposed for mundane construction projects, or simply abandoned to lie where they fell, gradually sinking into earth that has closed over them like a healing wound. The archaeological record itself bears witness to this fragmented survival, but in ways that reveal as much about the limitations of our knowledge as about the achievements of ancient peoples. The acidic soils of Brittany, while excellent for preserving the foundations of stone monuments, have proven hostile to organic materials that might otherwise have provided crucial insights into the daily lives of the monument builders. Bones that could have revealed details about diet, health, and social structure have dissolved into chemical traces that sophisticated analysis can sometimes detect but rarely interpret with precision. Wooden artifacts, textile fragments, leather goods, plant remains, all the perishable components of Neolithic life have vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving us to reconstruct entire cultures from the durable remnants of their stone architecture and ceramic traditions. Yet even these stone survivors tell incomplete stories. Many of the burial chambers that once sheltered the remains of Neolithic elites have been disturbed by treasure hunters, amateur archaeologists, or simple curiosity across the centuries since their construction. The elaborate grave goods that originally accompanied the dead, those polished axes, decorated pottery vessels, and ornamental objects that speak of sophisticated craft traditions and complex social hierarchies, survive in fragmentary collections scattered across museums and private holdings, their original context disrupted, beyond recovery. We can admire the individual pieces, marvel at the skill of their creation, but we have lost the ability to read them as components of coherent burial programs that once communicated specific messages about status, identity, and beliefs concerning the afterlife. The gaps in our knowledge extend beyond material culture to encompass the entire realm of meaning that gave significance to these monuments in the minds of their creators, the stories, songs, and ritual traditions that once explained why specific stones were erected in particular locations, why certain alignments took precedence over others, why some individuals merited elaborate burial while others left no trace in the archaeological record. All of this intangible heritage has vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving us with the physical remnants of a belief system whose animating principles we can only guess at through careful analysis and informed speculation. This incompleteness carries a weight that extends beyond mere scholarly frustration to touch fundamental questions about memory, permanence, and the relationship between human ambition and temporal limitation. The communities that created Carnac invested enormous effort in constructing monuments designed to endure across geological time, yet they could not preserve the meanings that justified such investments. The stones have outlasted the civilization that erected them, but in surviving, they have become enigmas rather than explanations, riddles rather than answers to the questions that drove their construction. The poignancy of this situation becomes most acute when we consider what recent archaeological discoveries suggest about the richness of the social world that surrounded the monuments. The hearths uncovered at La Plasca, the evidence of communal feasting and social celebration that accompanied stone erection, the careful organisation of labour and resources that such projects required, all of this points toward communities with complex traditions of storytelling, music, ritual performance, and social interaction that must have been as sophisticated as anything in the contemporary civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt, yet has left no recoverable trace in the archaeological record. Modern science offers some hope for recovering fragments of this lost world through increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques. Chemical analysis of soils can sometimes detect the residues of ancient organic materials, revealing the locations of wooden structures or organic offerings that have long since decomposed. Advances in dating methodology allow us to establish more precise chronologies, helping to correlate different aspects of the monument complex and understand their development over time. Digital reconstruction techniques can help us visualize how the landscape might have appeared when the alignments were complete and actively maintained by their builders. Yet for all these technological advances, we must ultimately accept that much of what made Carnac meaningful to its creators has passed beyond recovery. The songs that accompanied stone-raising ceremonies, the stories that explained cosmological relationships encoded in the alignments, the personal names and individual histories of the people buried in the great tumuli, these have dissolved into silence as complete as that which now surrounds the monuments themselves. This silence between the stones speaks to something universal about the human condition, our simultaneous desire for permanence and our inevitable subjection to the forces of change and forgetting that reshape all human institutions across the spans of deep time. As you prepare to leave the ancient stones behind, returning from this moonlit journey through 6 millennia to the familiar world of the present, the monuments of Carnac offer one final lesson, perhaps the most important one of all. Despite everything that has been lost, despite the centuries of neglect and misunderstanding, despite the countless stones that have fallen and the meanings that have dissolved into silence, something essential endures. The alignments still stretch across the Breton moorland, their granite forms as patient and enduring as they were when the last Neolithic builders laid down their tools and walked away, satisfied that they had created something worthy of the ages. This persistence speaks to something profound about human nature and the relationship between ambition and time. The communities that created Carnac possessed no written language to preserve their intentions, no metal tools to ease their labour, no knowledge of engineering principles that we would recognize as systematic or scientific. Yet they conceived and executed a project of such scope and durability that it continues to inspire wonder 6,000 years after its completion. Their achievement challenges every comfortable assumption about the supposed primitiveness of prehistoric peoples, revealing instead sophisticated communities capable of long-term planning, complex social organization, and an understanding of both stone and landscape that allowed them to create monuments of extraordinary permanence and power. The recent discoveries at La Plasca and other sites around Carnac have added new dimensions to this already remarkable story, revealing the social warmth and communal celebration that accompanied the great work of monument building. The hearths that burned beside the rising stones speak of projects undertaken not in grim religious obligation or forced labour, but in the spirit of collective achievement that transforms necessary work into occasions of joy and community bonding. These ancient peoples understood something that our modern world, with its emphasis on individual accomplishment and immediate gratification, sometimes struggles to grasp, that the most meaningful achievements emerge from sustained collective effort directed toward goals that extend far beyond the lifespan of any individual participant. The stones of Carnac also offer gentle instruction about the relationship between permanence and impermanence that governs all human endeavours. No civilization, however powerful, endures forever in the form its creators intended. The Roman Empire fell, the medieval world gave way to modernity, and our own technological civilization will someday be remembered only through its surviving artifacts, interpreted by minds we cannot imagine using categories we would not recognize. Yet within this universal story of rise and decline, certain gestures transcend the particular circumstances of their creation to speak across the centuries to fundamental aspects of human experience. The act of raising stones, of investing enormous labour in monuments designed to outlast their builders, represents one such transcendent gesture. It speaks to the human refusal to accept that individual existence is all there is, to the persistent belief that communities can create something greater than the sum of their parts, something that will carry forward the best of what they achieved into an unimaginable future. The people of Carnac may not have anticipated that their monuments would be studied by archaeologists using radiocarbon dating and ground-penetrating radar, but they clearly intended their work to speak to whoever might encounter it across the vast expanses of time. Recent scientific investigations have validated this ancient hope in ways its original creators could never have envisioned. The sophisticated techniques that have revealed new secrets buried beneath the Carnac landscape demonstrate that our understanding of the past remains dynamic, subject to continuous reinterpretation and renewal as new methods of investigation become available. The hearths discovered at La Plasca, invisible to generations of earlier archaeologists, remind us that even the most thoroughly studied sites can still yield surprises, still force us to revise our assumptions about ancient peoples and their capabilities. This continuing capacity for revelation suggests something hopeful about the relationship between past and present. The monuments of Carnac are not simply museum pieces, frozen artifacts from a bygone age, but living components of an ongoing conversation between ancient achievements and contemporary understanding. Each new discovery, each refined interpretation, each moment of wonder experienced by visitors walking among the stones adds new layers of meaning to what the original builders created, extending their project forward into our own time and beyond. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson that Carnac offers to our contemporary world, that the most profound human achievements transcend the immediate circumstances of their creation, to become part of a larger conversation about what it means to be human, to live in community, to invest hope in projects that extend beyond individual lifetimes. The Neolithic peoples who raised these stones understood intuitively what our own age sometimes forgets in its preoccupation with rapid change and instant communication, that true achievement requires patience, persistence, and faith in purposes that may not be fulfilled within the lifetime of any single generation. As you walk away from the alignments, leaving them to their ancient vigil beneath the stars, you carry with you something of their patient endurance, their quiet testimony to the power of collective human effort directed toward permanent ends. The stones will continue their weight, marking time not in seasons or years but in centuries and millennia, witnesses to whatever civilizations rise and fall around them, guardians of the profound truth that some things, once created with sufficient care and intention, become truly eternal elements in the continuing human story.